He deserves to be remembered as one of America's most accomplished diplomats. We miss you, Jeff.
I have learned long ago that never would I contradict the Honorable Jeff Bader when it came to anything Asia.
I don't know how you do But if it was it oh, wait a minute. We have a really good
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Cecilia Rouse, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Jeffrey A. Bader Memorial Lecture. I would like to extend an especially warm welcome to Rohini Talala, Jeff's wife, who's joining us virtually today. I did not have the pleasure of working with Jeff Bader before his passing last year, but according to his Brookings colleagues, He was a man committed to eye-watering candor, yet deep kindness and empathy. It is not often that you encounter someone with both a blistering intellect and benevolent nature. Jeff was a rare find with a career equally as exceptional. A towering diplomat, scholar, and advisor in the field of China studies, Jeff had a decades-long career spanning multiple administrations of both parties, serving in the U.S. Department of State, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the National Security Council. In 2005, Jeff joined Brookings as the founding director of the John L. Thornton China Center, which remains one of the top centers for the study of U.S.-China relations in the world. To honor Jeff's legacy, this annual lecture series will bring renowned speakers to Brookings to foster candid conversations. I can think of no one better to kick us off than Ambassador Susan Rice, my former colleague. Just as Jeff was, Susan is a towering figure in her field. An expert in foreign as well as domestic policy, she has an incredible range of experience and has served as UN Ambassador, National Security Advisor, and Domestic Policy Council Director, to name just a few. But we are particularly proud of Susan today because she is one of our own. For 7 years, Susan was a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, just as her mother, Lois Rice, was an economic studies expert at Brookings before her. Susan, we're honored to welcome you back to Brookings for this special event. Finally, I would like to share that we've created the Jeffrey A. Bader Memorial Lecture Fund to support this annual series. We are deeply grateful to Ambassador John Huntsman and Jerry Wang for their significant contributions, which made today's event possible. We're also circulating cards with information on how you can contribute to the fund, should you be interested. I would now like to turn the podium over to Ryan Haas, who serves as a senior fellow and director of the John L. Thornton China Center, as well as Chen Fu and Cecilia Yenku, chair of Taiwan Studies at Brookings. Ryan will moderate a fireside chat with Susan, after which they will take questions from the audience. Ryan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, President Rouse. That was a wonderful introduction.
Rouse. I like that.
It was a wonderful introduction, and Jeff deserves every word of it. I also want to thank Ambassador Rice. You are in extremely high demand across the country, and the fact that you would take this time to honor Jeff is a tribute to him, but also a tribute to yourself. I plan on spending the next hour organizing our conversation around a few themes. The first will be around leadership, and then foreign policy, domestic policy, and then how we're looking at the 2024 election and the year ahead.
Of course.
I promise I will save time for you as well to pose questions to Ambassador Rice at the end of our hour. But before we turn to leadership issues, I want to take a minute to ask you about the man that we're here to honor, Jeff Bader. You worked with Jeff here at Brookings, in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration. You've seen him in all kinds of different settings. What most stands out to you as you think back on your experiences with Jeff?
Well, I've got so many warm memories of Jeff. But before I get to Jeff, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to CC, President Rouse. Thank you to you, Ryan, for being such a wonderful friend and colleague. Thank you to all of my former Brookings colleagues who've been so warm in welcoming me back here. It's great to be at Brookings, and it really is a special place for me and for my family. So no better place to be, in particular to talk about somebody that I love as much as I love Jeff Bader. As you said, I've worked with Jeff in many different incarnations over the years, going back to when he was at the National Security Council in the Clinton administration, and I was at the NSC, and then when he was ambassador to Namibia at the end of the Clinton administration, I was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So we worked together then, and then we were colleagues at Brookings, and we worked together on the Obama campaign, and we worked together in the Obama administration. And what stands out to me about Jeff is this combination that Cece alluded to of incredible warmth and generosity of spirit, but also piercing intellect and very tough-minded when it comes to the issues and the problems. And yet, nobody had a more impish smile, a more ready laugh. Nobody cared more for friends and colleagues. He was an amazing and devoted husband to Rohini, whom he adored, and who ensured that we all got to know and adore Rohini as well. I miss him, and especially being here in this place and thinking back to all the time we had together. Nobody knew China as well as Jeff, in my opinion, and had this amazing combination of, personal feel, deep academic knowledge, and an understanding of the complexities and the challenges that were inherent in the U.S.-China relationship. And, I have one regret only, and I did my best, but I really wish that he'd had the opportunity to be our ambassador to China. That didn't work, but he served in so many critical ways that were vital to our national interests. And I think he'll be remembered also as somebody who truly, truly invested in people and the next generation of China scholars and leaders that have come.
Well, it's a wonderful reflection on Jeff. I want to pick up where you just ended. I and many others were beneficiaries of Jeff's mentorship. And I know that you spent a lot of time mentoring people as well. But I want to get personal with you for a second. If you could go back to a younger version of yourself and offer advice to yourself as you launched into your professional and public career, what would it be?
Well, I'm embarrassed to answer this question in this context because some of these folks here worked with my younger self. They probably have answers of their own to that question. There's some things about, when I think back to my early career, in particular to my service in the Clinton administration, when I was privileged to begin working on the National Security Council staff, I was 28 years old. I was a director on the NSC staff, and within 2 years, I became a senior director running the Africa office. My first job was working on the United Nations in peacekeeping. And then at age 32, I was named Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So I was in big positions of responsibility at a very early age. And needless to say, I got some things right and I got some things wrong. And I learned some real lessons in leadership and growth along the way. The things that I would say to a young Susan Rice about what I got right and what I would do again, I think for better or for worse, I was confident in who I was, and I brought that confidence into the room, which was necessary as somebody of that age, but in particular as somebody who looks like me. And that offended some people, that impressed some people, that created some adversaries along the way. But being fearless, being forthright, being unabashed, I think is something I would advise others to be. Mm-hmm. What I would say I did wrong was I was insufficiently patient, and I remain so impatient, but I'm getting better, I hope, at almost 60 versus early 30s. I learned sometimes the hard way that policymaking is a team sport, and that you have to bring out the knowledge, the experience, the inputs, the perspectives of everybody on the team and value them and appreciate them and listen to them and learn from them. In that way, you're more likely to not only get to the right answers, but get to the right approach to implementing the right answers in a way that's much more sustainable. I think leading a policymaking process is analogous to either conducting an orchestra or playing point guard on a basketball team, which is something that I did not very well, but frequently in high school.
Well, you've worked very directly with three presidents, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden. What can you draw from those experiences? What attributes distinguish each of these leaders?
Well, three great presidents to work for. I'm so grateful and proud to have been able to do so. But three really different people. President Clinton has, or had, and I believe has, what I can only describe as a photographic memory. Just an extraordinary ability to retain what he reads and perhaps also what he hears. Very thoughtful, smart, probing intellect. I think he grew enormously over the years that got to work with him. And yet, as people may recall, he also had this, uncanny ability to make the people he was engaging with feel valued and seen and heard. President Obama, maybe the smartest person I've ever had the privilege to work with. You would write a memo or present a briefing to him. You had better be ready, as you know, because you worked with him, for the second and third and fourth order questions. And if you could make a persuasive case and argument and defend it, he had this ability to probe and absorb and make sure he elicited the inputs and opinions of, everybody who mattered. And to him, everybody who mattered was not just the senior people in the room, but more importantly, the experts in the room on the back of the bench in the Situation Room. And then when he thought he had all the information that he needed, he would often say, well, I'm going to sleep on it, and come back the next day with a decision. And he was not, he deliberated, but he didn't tarry over difficult decisions. And then once they were decided, we marched on and implemented, and it was, a pretty straightforward process. President Biden has the most uncanny gut instinct of anybody I've ever had the privilege to work for. A feel for people, a feel for process, a feel for timing. And I think that accounts for his legislative successes, which really have been unmatched, at least since Lyndon Johnson. You could, he would take perhaps more time to make a consequential decision, and he might revisit it and come back to it from different angles and different perspectives. Once he made a decision, he was all in and completely committed to it. Or I should put this in the present tense. He is all in and committed to it. But there were times when he would say, this is something I want to do, but now is not the right time. And it took me a while to sort of understand, how he was thinking. He was really sequencing the landing of the planes that he wanted to ensure, were, issues or actions that got completed. But he had a sense of how it had to be sequenced to maximize success in the aggregate, not just on the issue that you might be working on. So, as I said, three really different leaders, but wonderful presidents, each of them, and I feel so lucky to have gotten to learn from them.
You're the first person in history to lead both the National Security Council and also the Domestic Policy Council. How did your work in foreign policy prepare you to deal with domestic issues? And if I can be slightly mischievous, who do you prefer dealing with, foreign leaders or American leaders?
Or what?
Or American legislators.
You mean members of Congress?
Yes.
Depends which ones. There's some of each that I could do without. It's interesting. I think I was really fortunate to bring 25 plus years of national security decision-making process experience to the work on the domestic side. I mean, I think many of you know that in national security decision-making really has a structure to it. There's the interagency working groups and the deputies committee and the principals committee and presidential directives and decision memoranda and, a very, sort of well-oiled approach to how you surface issues, surface options, make recommendations and decisions, and then follow and track their implementation on the national security side. And rarely, with the exception of the prior administration, has that process sort of failed to operate in a predictable and pretty uniform fashion. That has not been the case in many instances on the domestic policy side for a variety of reasons. It's been more of an ad hoc, more of a, come as you are approach, driven by the nature of the president or by the people working on domestic policy. We have not always had the same structure and rigor in terms of, deputies, principals, decision memos, and follow-up implementation. And what President Biden explicitly asked me to do, having worked with me in national security over the course of the Obama administration, was to bring that structure and rigor to the domestic policy side. And so, I ran that office and that effort, though much smaller in terms of personnel, in very much the same way I ran the interagency as national security advisor. And President Biden issued early in the administration the domestic policy equivalent of what is the National Security Decision Directive number 1, or whatever you want, PPD 1, it changes whatever administration, but it's the decision directive that instructs the national security interagency as to how to run their processes, who's on the NSC, how it gets crafted and how it's meant to function. I did the same with President Biden's support on the domestic policy side, which gave me the tools that I needed to run a process for domestic decision-making, which was analogous to what has long been the case on the national security side.
Interesting.
Some of the cabinet agencies weren't quite accustomed to that, but they adjusted.
Well, we won't pin you down for details on that, but I take your word for it. If I can shift briefly to foreign affairs and leadership on the world stage. Public opinion, public perceptions of the United States dipped a bit in the previous administration. They have
A bit.
They have regained in this administration. I wanted to get your sense for how you diagnose that, but even more fundamentally, why does it matter to the American people how the United States is perceived abroad?
Well, for the diagnosis, I think it's pretty simple. It helps when you don't tell the world to go screw itself.
Okay, got that.
Basic. It helps when your friends and allies feel treated like friends and allies.
Yeah.
I do think it matters because leadership is also a team sport. And leadership requires that there be team members who are valued and respected and feel they have a contribution to make, and that their interests and perspectives matter. And, in a world where we're seeing, that's period, all the time the case, but I think it's particularly the case in the context of, a increasing alignment, if not alliance, among our principal adversaries. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are all, increasingly collaborating into what some might call an axis of authoritarianism. And against that backdrop, the United States having friends and partners that respect our leadership and prefer to work with us rather than against us, whether they're in Europe or Asia or Africa or Latin America, matters enormously.
Right. Well, we're here to honor Jeff, and so I feel a certain obligation to ask a question about China, even though this is a broader discussion. Jeff, as you mentioned, was the leading thinker of his generation on all issues related to China. He played a fundamental role in architecting our approach, our strategy towards China, and that's a legacy that will carry on. But how do you look at the relationship between the United States and China today, and where do you see it heading going forward?
Well, I'd love to have a dialogue about this because your views are so interesting to me. But, I mean, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the most complicated and fraught periods in the U.S.-China relationship since normalization. Mm-hmm. We're dealing with a very different China than, frankly, the one you and I worked with or dealt with now, 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's a China that's much more aggressive, that is really unconstrained by international rules and norms and laws, and unabashed about it. And it's one, as I said, that is increasingly not just collaborating with, but I think, coordinating and strategizing with others among our principal adversaries. And, it therefore increases the risk of confrontation and conflict, which I think we have an interest in seeking to avoid, even as we stand up for our core interests and our values and our friends in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So the challenge is, as you often hear it said, is to manage our competition to the greatest extent possible without that tipping into conflict, if that can be avoided. And in my opinion, also critically in preserving space for dialogue and for cooperation, if and where possible, on things that serve our mutual interests. I still happen to believe that there are global issues ranging from climate to disease that the United States nor China can tackle in isolation. That there has to be some measure of coordination and collaboration. And so, being able to do those things is critical. But we're a long way from, the period in which, the U.S. and China were able to work together on things like a Iran nuclear deal or nuclear nonproliferation as it related to North Korea, or the nuclear security summits, or even the Ebola epidemic in West Africa.
Right.
And that's, I think, sadly, going to be the pattern for the foreseeable future. And it's going to take really deft leadership to advance our interests and our security, our economic well-being through things like protecting our technological advances and edge, through preserving and protecting our supply chains, while at the same time trying to avoid an outcome in which we see the world splinter into two competing economic camps, where nobody benefits, or we certainly benefit to a lesser extent because we're competing for a share of a much smaller pie.
Right. I have one final question on foreign policy, and then we can shift to domestic. But President Biden often talks about how we're at an inflection point in history, that this moment is very critical, very fluid. As you look out over the next decade, what do you see as the major issues or obstacles that the United States is going to have to contend with and think through?
Well, I think we've started talking about some of them, right?
Right.
Certainly a China with a different focus and orientation, collaborating with a revanchist, aggressive Russia that is, continuing to push the envelope, and also collaborating with Iran and North Korea. That challenge is, I think, a core one. But I think it's complicated by, the extraordinarily rapid advances in technology, and particularly the impact of artificial intelligence and the potential for artificial intelligence to morph into artificial general intelligence or AGI or even artificial superintelligence, how that plays not into things like drone warfare, that's petty, really, in the big scheme, or even how it influences our nuclear doctrine, which is hugely important, but how it impacts the broader strategic competition, as well as our economic competition, and how we manage that competition in the context of technology without risking this technology driving it out of control, where I think there's not an inconsequential potential that there could be loss of human control. And so how do we manage all of that? How do we govern globally this very complicated technology and set up a mechanism both whereby the United States can preserve and extend our strengths and advantages, but at the same time ensure that technology benefits the parts of the developing world that are already too far behind, and how we prevent that competition with competitors like China from spinning out of control.
Right. I feel like your answer has given us a bit of homework at Brookings.
You got a lot of homework at Brookings. Can I ask one other thing? Another area that I think we in the United States aren't thinking enough about is how do we revise and energize the global trading system in a way that not only serves our own domestic interests, but also extends benefits to parts of the world that are left behind. I mean, I think we have sort of taken a vacation from thinking sufficiently creatively about global trade. I'm not opposed in any way, shape, or form to to building up our domestic base and our manufacturing capacity and securing our supply chains. I think we absolutely have to do all of that, and protecting our most sensitive technologies. But at the same time, we can't walk away from global trade, and we can't be oblivious to how our approaches affect countries and peoples that really have no choice but to be part of the global trading system.
I'm happy to hear you emphasize that. I think that's a underappreciated element of the discussion in Washington these days. If I could shift now to domestic policy. You mentioned earlier that you thought that President Biden had the best domestic record since President Johnson.
Legislative record.
Legislative record.
And of course, that's not at all self-serving.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about, because as the head of the Domestic Policy Council, you played a fundamental role in lowering prescription drug prices, relieving student debt, reunifying unaccompanied minors separated from their families at the southern border. I'm going to ask you to pick among your favorite children here. What do you think was the greatest success domestically of this administration?
Well, first of all, there are many things that I'm proud of as a citizen and as somebody who was able to serve with Cece and others in the Biden administration that weren't narrowly within my remit in domestic policy. I mean, the economic successes, things like the infrastructure legislation, the CHIPS and Science Act, efforts to reshore manufacturing, the economic recovery post-COVID, the job creation, which has been, historic, the lowest levels of unemployment for African Americans and others who have long suffered persistently high unemployment. These are all economic achievements that I owe credit to my colleagues for. On the domestic policy side, you did touch on a number of the things that I'm proud of, some of which really don't get a lot of attention. You mentioned unaccompanied minors, but it's really, people may forget the Trump administration separated thousands of children from their families and kept no records of, who these kids were and who their parents were. And one of the things that we spent, a huge amount of time on, and it was difficult and thankless and got no press, was reunifying many of these children with their families. And, we were able to do that to a very remarkable extent and whittle down to, a very limited core, the number of kids that remained unreunited. And so that's an example of something that nobody pays any attention to, but I think on a human level is hugely important. We have had the most impactful and effective relationship with our tribal nations in this country than any other administration in a very long time. We've been able to advance and secure the rights of LGBTQ Americans in a way that I think many people don't pay attention to. So those are sort of some of the unnoticed things. But I have to say, if you ask me to point to the things that have been most impactful to everyday Americans, it certainly comes in the healthcare sphere, where we were able to extend healthcare coverage to more Americans than has ever been the case, and bring the uninsured rate in the United States down to the lowest level in history. Mm-hmm. That's a big, huge deal, and that was expanding the Affordable Care Act and the subsidies to enable people to afford coverage under the Affordable Care Act. It was working with states like North Carolina, among others, to enable the expansion of Medicaid so that many more people were able to be covered where they weren't previously. It's the Inflation Reduction Act and the unprecedented ability now that the administration, the executive branch, has to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs down for seniors on Medicare, and most recently announced the first 10 drugs that are drugs that everybody in this room is taking for diabetes, for blood pressure, for cancer, that were completely unaffordable if you lived in the United States. Fine if you lived in Canada or Europe or wherever. The fact that seniors on Medicare starting next year will not pay more than $2,000 for their prescription drugs, no matter how expensive their cancer medications might be, is an enormous accomplishment, and bringing the cost of insulin down to $35 a month as a high watermark, when people were paying hundreds of dollars a month in many instances on Medicare and elsewhere. Those are things that I think are tangible, concrete, and will be, frankly, hard to undo. And the good thing about these healthcare reforms is that they're still kicking in. I mean, there's more to come, and I'm hopeful that if we are to have a Harris administration, then we'd have the opportunity to extend many of these benefits, $2,000 cap on prescription drugs, $35 insulin, to people of all ages, not just those who are on Medicare.
Well, you've already sort of addressed this question, but as you look forward, it's sort of the same question on a forward-looking basis. Where do you see the greatest opportunity to use domestic policy to improve people's lives? What's sort of in the category of unfinished business that you would like your successor to drive forward?
Well, there's a lot. It would help very much if there were an amenable Congress and obviously a Harris administration. I think I touched on the healthcare side. There are many of these important reforms that can be broadened and expanded. I think that obviously with cooperation from Congress, the opportunity to codify Roe v. Wade and to codify voting rights, both of which have been have experienced huge violence from the courts, are critical priorities. In terms of the domestic policy agenda, you asked about unfinished business. I mean, one of the key pieces of unfinished business from the Biden administration has been on things like child care, paid family and medical leave, elder care, which are often lumped together in the so-called care agenda. I think that's hugely important for affordability for Americans and enabling people to deal with the often overwhelming challenge of supporting an elderly parent or children who need quality care while their parents work. I also think that there's a huge amount to be done in the housing sphere, and you've heard Vice President Harris talk about the importance of trying to build 3 million more housing units in the near term and making housing, particularly for first-time home buyers, more affordable, bringing down rents. I think that's all hugely important, and that too was a part of what you may recall as the Build Back Better agenda, much of which we were able to achieve in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, but much of which didn't make it through, largely because of Senator Manchin.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to our audience. You have...
I should also say, in fairness, Senator Manchin made it possible to get the Inflation Reduction Act. So,
okay. Well, we'll give him that. You have worked very closely with Vice President Harris. How would you describe to all of us her leadership style, and what do you expect her to prioritize if she becomes elected?
Well, I think, first of all, I should say, just for context, I first met her, then not even then Senator, I guess Attorney General Harris, before she ran for the Senate, then had the opportunity to engage with her occasionally in the Senate, and as she ran for president in 2019. And then, of course, to work with her in the White House when I was working on domestic policy. And I guess if I were going to describe her, I would say she's very smart. She's tough. But tough at the same time as I think she really cares about and always is curious about and concerned about the impact of policies and decision-making on regular people. So she's the one in the room who's saying, but what about how this affects X, Y, and Z people? I think she's very much got a temperament that's suited to being a commander-in-chief. She's deliberative. She's, even-keeled. She prosecutes the issues, not just the people. So she really probes and pressure tests, and it can put a weak-kneed staffer on their heels if they're not ready to answer tough questions. I think that's a good thing. But she's got all of the capacity, I think, to be a very effective president. What is she going to prioritize? I mean, I think she's been articulating that in a very helpful way, and it seems like everybody except the media is paying attention she's talked a lot about reducing costs for families, and she's talked about it not only in the context of everyday things that you buy in the grocery store or whatever, but very importantly, housing costs and health care costs. She's talked about the importance she attaches to an economy that is serving working and middle-class Americans as opposed to the super wealthy and big corporations. So I think in terms of tax policy, she's been clear that she's going to not increase taxes, as President Biden committed to, on anybody earning less than $400,000 a year. But beyond that, the rich need to pay their fair share, and the middle class need to get the benefit of the tax breaks. And the tax policy is going to be on the agenda front and center early in 2025 when the Trump tax cuts expire, and ensuring that that we extend and make permanent the refundable child tax credit, which was a signature accomplishment the first year of the Biden administration, which resulted in reducing child poverty in this country by almost half. it was extraordinary how effective and how quickly that piece of tax policy yielded benefits. And it is something that we can and we should, make permanent and extend. So I'm sure that will be a priority. She's spoken a lot about that. And then, of course, codifying Roe, ensuring voting rights, preserving and protecting our democracy, all of those are vitally important priorities as well. And she's really focused on, the challenge that so many Americans are facing, which is, they're working as hard as they can, sometimes multiple jobs, just to stay afloat. And that's not sufficient. And we need to create an economy where people who are working hard can get ahead and can give their kids the hope and expectation that, as we've had in past generations, that they too can do well and, in fact, do better than we are.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight. It's a really unique perspective. I now want to turn the floor to you all to ask questions of Ambassador Rice. Please be brief with your question. Introduce yourself. We'll start with Sheldon Ray. We'll take questions 2 at a time.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ambassador Rice, for being here. These relationships are extremely complex. We all understand that. But many of our allies, as well as adversaries, are somewhat disturbed and befuddled about the U.S.-India relationship, where India, like China, is buying Russian oil. I think Russia is still India's largest weapons supplier. And then today we find that India has supposedly been providing support for the war in Ukraine. And while we vilify China, Modi gets a state dinner.
So let's take one other question.
Is there a question there?
Hi, nice to meet you again, Mr. Rice. We met in Beijing this summer. So my question is, what do you think are President Biden's unfinished policy objectives on China? And in the possibly last meeting between the two presidents of China and the United States at the end of this year, how likely do you think it is that they will be able to accomplish a new list of concrete policy goals, like how they did in San Francisco last year, including resuming mill talks, cooperation on AI and anti-drugs? And what might that list look like? Thank you.
So I get to pretend to be a foreign policy person speaking for the Biden administration, which I'm not going to pretend to be. So I'm speaking in my own voice from my own perspective. I think on U.S.-China, I do hope that there's an opportunity for President Biden and President Xi to have at least one more engagement, ideally in person, but if not, through some other means. But I don't think it's realistic to expect a whole bunch of new deliverables, so to speak. Frankly, I think we would want to see and hope to cement really meaningful cooperation on fentanyl and precursors and have that sustained. I think that, there's been some progress. It's not been perfect or sufficient. The AI dialogue, as I understand it, has been pretty superficial and not particularly substantive. That should change. It's time. Mill-to-mill ties, I think that in communication, that's just sort of basic hygiene and ought to be sustained. But, I don't think, let's be frank, that what came out of last year's summit was much in the way of a big deal. It was better than nothing, and it was an important reset, or at least, putting as you used to like to say, putting a floor on things. But I don't think we should overstate the substantive outcomes of that, certainly relative to what it has been the case in the past. And there's some very difficult issues on the trade front, on China's overt support for Russia's actions in Ukraine, that will need to continue to be part of not just the dialogue, but that we have to see real action on. And in answer to the question on India, nobody's suggesting that the U.S.-India relationship or India's relationship with any of its proximate neighbors is a simple or one-dimensional one. India is a complicated player and partner, but an important one for the United States. And even as we differ on things ranging from treatment of minorities and human rights to the role that India plays, its dual role vis-a-vis Russia and even occasionally with China. It is a huge player on the global stage, and one that I believe it's in our interest to work with and seek common interests with, even as we recognize that India's interests are in many ways not going to align with ours. They also aren't aligning with China's, and in some respects not with Russia. So we need to be savvy and manage that complex relationship wisely and carefully, and not try to view the U.S.-India relationship, which is obviously and importantly multidimensional, through a pretty simplistic prism.
We can invite other questions. There's a question right here, and I also want to give Ambassador Rudd the opportunity, if he would like, to say a word. He was very close with Jeff Bader.
If you can ask about Jeff, or talk about Jeff, rather.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your wide-ranging briefings. And my name is Ainalam, and I'm from Ethiopia. When your active roles in Africa, which was a decade or so long, I was in my undergrad, hoping that you actively follow the recent order of disorder, especially in East Africa. I want to know your paintings and your briefings in terms of things happening in East African region. You can say Sudan. It's unfortunate for Ethiopia, Somalia, and Egypt is coming there. So what is the stake of the U.S. and what is your prospect? What will happen in the near future, having your extensive experience in the region? Thank you.
Ambassador Rudd, would you like to?
Thanks for the opportunity to reflect on Jeff and to pose a question which is very Jeff-related and builds on something that Susan said before. Jeff, who I knew for about 20 years, was always a duck who flew with two wings extended. One wing was hard national security policy on the China question, and the other was one which recognized what Susan pointed to before, which is the importance in the Indo-Pacific and what we earlier called the Asia-Pacific of the economic trade and investment agenda. He said that this duck does not fly unless both wings are flapping. That's my Australian paraphrase of the more impeccable prose of Jeffrey A. Bader. But building on those reflections, Susan, I'd be interested for you to reflect further on if Vice President Harris is elected as President Harris, and what you said before about revisiting the trade agenda, how can that best be done through the prism of supply chain security from the US perspective, and how is that then extended into the wider region? If, for example, we end up with a Congress which is still hostile to the further passage of, shall we say, formal free trade agreements or other forms of trade liberalization.
Well, I thought you were going to say nice things about Jeff. Not enough. To be honest, Kevin, I don't have enough of a feel for how Vice President Harris's perspective has evolved on trade. I don't want to even pretend to wade into that, because I think it's just not an area where I've had the opportunity to really work with her. So I'll leave that to her and her team as they choose at the appropriate time. I do think that she's been, very much a part of and a believer in the efforts that the Biden-Harris administration has embarked on to shore up our supply chains, to preserve our technological edge in critical, sensitive technologies. And I don't expect that to change in any meaningful way. But beyond that, I'm not comfortable saying much more. We could spend all day talking about East Africa. I won't. I will simply say that many of the things that are transpiring there are deeply tragic and concerning to me personally, as somebody who spent a lot of time working on Africa, but also, most importantly, to the people of the region who really are suffering, and nowhere more than in Sudan, again and again and again. From Darfur to the civil conflict, it's horrific and heartbreaking. And what has always been a complex set of problems within Sudan have now become even more complicated by the fact that many outside powers, particularly in the Gulf, have taken to that country and that region as their playground for their own competitions, and that has only exacerbated the suffering. And I think my personal opinion is that U.S. policy towards our towards the countries of the Gulf and others who are playing in the East African region has to take into account what is happening in East Africa, not simply what's happening in the Middle East and our obviously important and pressing interests and concerns there.
We have time for one more question. Let's take it from the lady in the back with the blue dress.
Thank you. What advice would you give Americans who are concerned about the genocide against the Palestinians and feeling like they're hitting a brick wall in Washington? Particularly people who are simply speaking up for human life and rights under a law.
Well, I'm not sure it's my role to give advice to activists of any stripe. I think the administration is working day and night to try to finally achieve a ceasefire and the return of the hostages, an end to the suffering of the people in Gaza, and put in place the kinds of regional arrangements that can help ensure Israel's long-term security, which is vitally important to the United States and to the region as a whole. The suffering that the people of Palestine have endured is horrific, as was the suffering of the Israeli people after the unspeakable terrorist attack on October 7th. And the suffering is too much, and it needs to end. And I'm grateful and proud of the efforts of my friends and colleagues in the administration to try to end this. I can only imagine their frustration. And I can only imagine that, every day that passes for the families of those that are still held hostage or don't know the fate of their loved ones, what they're suffering through, and what they're enduring is horrific as well.
Well, Susan, we want to make sure that we give you the final word. If you have any reflecting thoughts, you're welcome to offer them. But this has been an incredibly rich conversation I think Jeff Bader would have been proud of. It has offered all of us an insight into what it looks like to serve at the highest levels of government, both on foreign issues as well as domestic, and given us a window into the rigor through which you think about these issues. So I'm very grateful.
The only thing I would say in closing is that I hope Jeff was watching. And I hope he knows how much he's loved and respected by all of us here and many, many more who aren't able to be here.
Well, please join me in thanking Susan Rice.